year 2087, a Freedom of Information request resulted in the declassification of nearly 100,000 documents. These documents revealed the existence of a secret division formed as a skunkworks in the Central Intelligence Agency. This organization is known as the AORD and is still active to this day. The scope of the declassified documents covers the years of 1987 to 2037 and goes a long way to explaining the events that unfolded at that time, as well as the direction the path of history has taken as a result. Despite heavy redactions and documents left out entirely, the FOI release was one of the most shocking collections of data ever revealed to the public. These are those documents. Case 453962, the poem. Object, risk level 3, kept in IH9 database. Background. A burgeoning modern artist looking to prove himself worthy of the fame his rich family has bought him begins working on an installation. He calls it attrition and claims it symbolizes not only the unforgiving creative process, but also the heart of his depression. In reality, the piece is to be a tragedy mask made up of crumpled-up one-sentence poems. As well as the sculpture itself, it became a performance art piece wherein he would write one-sentence poems on a slip of paper, briefly reread them, shake his head, crumple them up, and incorporate them into the sculpture. On July 2000, before the performance is to begin, he smokes opium with his friends, bragging to them about the ease with which he will complete this piece. He says all he has to do is to not try, and things have a way of working out for him. This is confirmed to be his attitude towards all of his own art, and life in general. He began the piece that night to a crowd of about a dozen local art socialites, many of which are his own friends or employees of his parents. His process was simple. Write the first thing that came to his head, reread it, decide it isn't good enough, crumple it up, and mush it into the sculpture. The only difficult part for him was doing this without leaving for 12 hours. As a joke, he had told his friends he would piss himself to make it more avant-garde, but he decided that storming out of the room periodically would be more fitting. After a few hours, most of the crowd had wandered away, and he began acting self-conscious about the performance aspect. But this nervous energy seemed to drive him on further. People in the crowd commented on his obvious agitation at the audience thinning, and how this performance art is truly a mirror to reality. This drew a few of the more flighty onlookers back to study his emotional duress. The cyclical nature of the audience didn't seem to relieve Mr. self-consciousness, as his agitation persisted at least as far as can be told by watching the footage of the event. Around 6 hours passed, marking the halfway point of his performance, and the frown of his sculpture was now apparent, and more guests arrived to witness his achievement. The crowd he had gathered made the artist appear smug as well as jittery, which in turn caused him to exaggerate his face. Instead of frustratedly dismissing the poems and crushing them in disgust, it appeared as if he was now just searching for perfection. This was apparently not by design, but rather a side effect of the artist's inability to act natural in front of a crowd. This was gleaned from the copious and frankly self-indulgent notes taken from Mr. room after the fact. As his close friends arrived, the effect worsened. Many in the audience began seeing faults in his emotional portrayal and scoffed quietly as they walked away. The artist showed no concern, however, presumably because he was used to or even appreciative of a certain level of derision for his works. At some point, he seemed to become more focused on the poetry, as multiple times he could be seen rereading or even memorizing a one-sentence poem before crumpling it up and adding it to the pile. According to his close friend, they had noticed this behavior as well, and had assumed Mr. would later pull apart the sculpture and make a book of the poems. At around hours, he wrote what would be his 4th poem. At this point, he seemed to be writing without thinking. We must assume this is the case, as he was able to complete the poem before reading it. We hypothesized that all the time he'd spent writing this far had blinded him from the content, and the words had lost all their meaning. It was only in rereading them that he ingested the actual phrase he'd written down. In a way, perhaps the truest way, he didn't know at all what he was doing. To say he didn't really write the 4th 57th phrase would be the truth. Nonetheless, he had created it. He had brought those words, in that combination, into this world. He'd been moving at such a frantic pace, he almost didn't commit the time to internalize what he'd written. He almost crumpled it up, after a cursory gaze, as he had done with the rest. However, even just looking at the phrase in this way made him freeze. On the security tape, it can be clearly seen that his body harshly stops in between the first reading and the second. Upon the second reading, the color drained out of his face, and tears began to flow unusually quickly from his eyes. He stared at the paper for an additional 20 seconds, and his mouth slowly opens in apparent shock and horror. After 20 seconds, he drops the paper and covers his face, which at this point has warped with emotion. Per the results of automated analysis, his face portrayed despair, sorrow, fear, and extreme sadness. To the audience, this was all very evocative. The subjects interviewed afterwards said they initially couldn't understand how he could make his own eyes water so instantly and so dramatically. They imagined the poem he'd written must be very emotionally moving and intense, and of course this assessment is correct. They said they were curious as to what was on the page, and this curiosity was maintained throughout. One subject suggested that perhaps it was the poem he was searching for. Another insinuated that they thought that now that he'd written this one, the show would be over, saying that he should leave the altar of frustration only halfway complete. The artist began breathing deep, wheezing breaths, his face still contorted. He seemed to be unsteady in his seat. For 30 seconds he breathed heavily and stared at the poem, presumably rereading it again. It's difficult to say for sure, but it appears this many rereadings only made his mental state worse. However, it's also possible that these rereadings simply failed to help the artist's mental state, as perhaps he was hoping. It could be postulated that rereading it multiple times could have been an attempt to reconceptualize the poem in his mind, to stop the spiraling cascade of negative emotions. Regardless, the artist was then in an inexorable and permanent state of extreme sadness and desperation. At around 58 seconds after the initial reading, he kicked to his feet and away from the table, scrambling into the back corner of the room. At this time, he also began to scream, cry, and wail. The crowd was startled by the sudden noise, and many genuinely recoiled as the artist vomited through his hands, which were still covering his mouth. The act of vomiting through his hands, covering a now permanent frown, was enough to make a few members of the crowd exit the room. Some stayed, but covered their eyes, and around 50% of the audience covered their ears, as the wailing was more disturbing to them. This is the general consensus of all those who have watched and listened to the recordings. That said, a small number of the audience members began to applaud, still thinking this was part of the performance. At this point, Mr. falls to the ground and begins convulsing, though upon review, it doesn't seem to be a true neurological seizure, but voluntary motions made as a result of mental duress. His friends, however, became very worried at this point and rushed across the velvet ropes to assist him. They knew something had to be wrong, but they couldn't make sense of it. He was clearly having a mental breakdown, but at no point in the lead-up to the performance had he shown any signs of pressure or stress. It was the general attitude of his close friends that he had never taken his art or anyone else's that seriously, and as such, this emotional breakdown was completely unexpected. As the artist continued to flail on the ground, his friends began screaming at the patrons of the gallery to call 911. They then attempted to comfort the retching artist, but they were halted, to their own admission, by the look on his face. According to them, and I quote, "From further away it wasn't as bad, but up close it was traumatic." It was so distressing to them that they were afraid to touch him. Something about his unnatural frown made it seem like whatever he was experiencing could be contagious. The artist then began rolling from side to side and speaking in a desperate tone. He tried to seek comfort or consolation from his friends, but he surely found none. Despite several attempts by experts and automated tools, we are unable to understand what he was saying to them. After a few seconds of this, his eyes returned to the table where the poem still was. At this point, his frantic rambling becomes much clearer and more desperate. He repeatedly said, "Don't read it." On hearing this, a few people in the crowd began to lean forward in curiosity, trying to catch a glimpse of the slip of paper. Seeing this, the artist shrieked and dove for the table, breaking it in half and snapping his shoulder out of its socket. Feverishly, he squeezed the poem in one hand and hurled it into the corner of the little stage. At no point during or after this action did Mr. seem relieved or satisfied in any way. The following minute or so consisted of the artist weeping and tearing out his hair and pieces of scalp as his friends tried to console and restrain him. At this point, the majority of the audience started to make their way out of the room. Many have attested that the sound of his crying was too much, and that they no longer believed it was part of the performance. During this time period, Mr. face became more visible in the footage, and it can be seen that his expression not only hasn't improved, but seemed to be either stuck or slowly getting worse. His mouth was pulled into a taut, open-mouthed, keening frown. His brows were scrunched, and his eyes and nose were still pouring fluid. Shaking off his friends, the artist dropped to his knees and rapidly pawed around the broken table with his one functional arm until he found the pen he had been using to write. On finding the pen, an old-fashioned metal fountain pen, he flopped his dislocated arm into his lap and began stabbing and ripping at his wrist repeatedly. Blood began to leak from the many wounds and quickly formed a large puddle beneath him before anyone could try to restrain him. Those in the audience who had yet to leave did so at this point. A few people who had left returned briefly, hearing the screams of onlookers, only to return to the other rooms. His friends then jumped on his arm, trying to hold him back from harming himself any further, but he heaved his arm away from them with uncommon strength, presumably fueled by adrenaline and a perceived absolute need to continue his suicide attempt. As soon as his arm was free, he began stabbing and slashing at his arms, legs, and torso. Yet more blood flowed from the fresh puncture holes. Finally, his friends were able to detain him using all of their combined might. In response to his detainment, the artist can be heard clearly once again, this time saying, "No, please, please, please don't stop me." Each of his friends held a limb down with their entire body weight and did their best to keep him from wriggling free. Unable to move effectively, the artist began putting all of his energy into screaming and heaving sobs. His friends were not trained in triage or first aid, so he was able to bleed out before the paramedics arrived. The audience would later state that his tears continued for minutes after the bleeding had ceased. This is backed up by the footage as well as corroborating witness testimony. Further, the individuals restraining him felt his body turn cold as he continued to weep. His last breath was a sob, and moisture continued to leak from the eyes well after the point of full brain death. Of the few people remaining in the room with the now expired Mr. one of them, a Miss, promptly sought out the poem and tore it into pieces without reading it. The others were in various states of shock or distress. The description of the event given to the emergency services was automatically flagged by our system, and shortly after, local case officers had taken control of the scene and began preliminary due diligence. As this case consists of an artist committing suicide by normal means, it was deemed unnecessary to fully cover up the event. However, the team did collect the unfinished sculpture for testing, where it was found to be made up of normal, uninspired poems with no anomalous effects. Research. It was only by closely scrutinizing the video footage that we were able to recreate the anomalous poem under controlled laboratory conditions. Since the torn pieces of the original poem were destroyed beyond repair by Miss Ch, as well as the blood from the scene, it's unknown whether the copy is less effective than the original, but it is very doubtful when comparing the test results to the original security footage. It was transcribed by a team of film and TV professionals from around Asia. These individuals had never learned any language that used the English alphabet, and had agreed never to do so, even by circumstance. Despite being unable to understand what they had seen, all of them came down with fevers and cold sweats for a period of 2 weeks after the transcription, and the majority of them now suffer from major depressive disorder. Once the poem had been transcribed, it was then subject to the IH9 protocols, and as such, all physical, digital, and circumstantial versions of the poem were destroyed after experimentation, with the exception of the master copy, which is kept in the IH9 database at 5.4.5. For the length of the research term, no copy of the poem existed for more than a period of 60 seconds. the maximum allowable lifetime for. In most cases, the poem was created digitally on a screen facing only the subject and immediately deleted. However, in one study, a paper copy was printed in Braille and then destroyed remotely as the test was underway. Research summary note. The research was done entirely in a soundproof room with recording devices in place, as well as a one-way mirror with electronically controlled snap clouding in case of emergencies. Due to the danger of the subject retaliating by recreating the poem, an automated system was put in place to monitor the room for any IH9 applicable symbols, phrases, or iconographs. If the subject were to attempt to recreate the poem, or any other already cataloged, the recording devices would automatically omit it, and the one-way glass would snap cloud in the case of a visible instance. In theory, this cuts off any danger of exposure. In every case, the subject would be led into the room, made to sit in the chair by coercion or force, and then shown the poem by an automated system, which would then promptly destroy the newly created copy of the poem as observation began, as per protocol. Test summary log. Test 1-1. Subject male, 9 years old, of Asian descent, pounds, tall. Shown the transcribed poem. Effects appear to be the same as the original. Subject self-terminated by smashing his head into the corner of the chair after 3 minutes. Brain scans show massive activity in the brain comparable to those experiencing grief and a panic attack. Field sensors found no evidence, and similarly, the arc sensor didn't react, and that radiation can be eliminated as a possibility. Test subject female, 7 years old, Irish descent, pounds, inches tall. Shown the poem. Effects began as expected. Subject self-terminated after 4 minutes. Scans and sensor readings are consistent with the last test. Research note. After tests, we've determined there is no statistically significant difference of the poem's effect from one subject to the other, at least in terms of gender, race, or trivial biological difference. It's possible a certain type of person may be able to withhold for longer. However, given we're only allowed a certain number of test subjects, it would make more sense to assume there will be no major difference in the effect from person to person. It's time to move on to a new lane of study. Test 90. Subject given the first 75% of the poem. There was no visible effect after a full 5 minutes, apart from the subject seemingly reading the fragment of a sentence to himself in consternation. Since the IH9 Protectorate detected the poem sample in the audio recording, all audio of the test is lost. After a short time, the subject's eyes widened, as if in realization, and the full effect of the poem began to ensue. It is presumed that the subject managed to fill in the blanks on his own, though there is no evidence of this apart from the brain scans and sensors being consistent with earlier tests. After 5 minutes, the subject self-terminated. Test 2. Subject Tim. Given the first 50% of the poem in order. The subject was told not to read aloud or repeat the words, or even openly discuss their contents, and because the subject willingly complied, we were able to retain the audio of the test. For a full 30 minutes, the subject appeared to ruminate on the half a poem, and repeatedly insisted that it didn't make sense. There was no obvious sign that the effect was taking place after a full 2 hours, and so the subject was allowed to return their quarters through autonomous guidance. After a further 7 hours, the subject became extremely distressed and demanded help from the researchers. This agitated state, though less severe than the normal effect of the poem, was serious enough to demand a complete quarantine. Without any sedation or treatment, the subject self-terminated after a further hour. Precautions should be taken in future so that we can further study this partially activated state. Test Subject given the first 50% of the poem in order. Subject refused to follow orders relating to reading the poem out loud, and thus audio from the test was lost. As a result, the potential risk of contamination was too great to return the subject to their room. After 5 hours in the test chamber, it is assumed that the test subject was under the impression that the uncompleted poem was some kind of psychological test, as they began visibly ruminating for a full 30 minutes. After this period, the test subject entered a partially affected state and began to weep. A deafened and autonomously protected member of the research staff entered the room and gave the subject antidepressants and sedatives. The antidepressants did essentially nothing, and the subject required triple the dose of sedatives to fully put them under. While tranquilized, tears continued to flow from the subject's eyes. After waking up, The effects of the poem returned, and could not be lessened again unless the subject was once more sedated. After initial observation period of 1 week, using sedatives every night and keeping the subject on suicide watch, testing moved on. Addendum. After 2 weeks and 3 days of partial effect, the subject self-terminated by throwing themselves neck first into the ground. It is unknown if the poem's effect grew worse over time, if the subject filled in the gaps of the poem after 2 weeks, or if the isolation from being completely unheard by the research staff was the primary cause of the subject's dramatic suicide. More testing is needed. Test 2. Subject given the first 50% of the poem in order. Following the last experiment, we had hoped to find a more agreeable subject so that we could more closely document the partially activated state. However, as documented in incident report, we had become too confident in the subject's obedience to account for all variables. The subject was shown the first half of the poem, and was told in no uncertain terms to not read it aloud, speak it afterwards, or write it down in any way. The subject has always been agreeable and well-behaved, and this test was no exception, as they quietly considered the half of the poem in silence for 3 hours before needing to urinate. It was while the subject was being escorted to the controlled testing restroom, the audio recording abruptly cut out, alerting research staff that the subject had spoken the poem aloud. From reviewing the tapes, it appears as if the subject murmured the poem to themselves, with no ill intent. However, research staffer and guard staff heard the half of the poem and immediately halted. Research staffers, having been researching the poem for several months, must have immediately filled in the rest of the poem in her head, as the full effect immediately began to take hold. She began screaming and crying, which alarmed subject, while guard staff, having a familiarity with the poem's nature himself, appeared to be in a typical state of shock, consistent with normal human reaction to a hopelessly bad situation. At around this time, the video recording was automatically altered to block the view of research staff's mouth, alerting research staff that she had spoken the poem aloud to the other two. The effect immediately became readily apparent on both subject and guard staff. However, guard staff quickly pulled his sidearm and terminated the other two and himself before the poem's effect could reach full severity. While this obviously represents an inadequate level of safety standards in the testing and a complete failure to meet experiment objectives, it is at least some consolation that we've learned the poem's effect is just as severe in spoken word format. This confirms the conjecture that it is a true IH9 and not a CH4 as some had proposed. Additionally, we have now confirmed that the automated IH9 AI is indeed addressing the possibility of lip reading, which had been an earnest fear on previous studies. Why this didn't activate on test 5 or 30 is a matter that requires further investigation. Research note. In response to the growing concern of outside contamination, we have reviewed the process and results of the last 400 tests and decided it is no longer worthwhile to continue researching the partial activation state. The variables are too many and too uncontrollable. Furthermore, there is every possibility that the portion of the poem, especially if it's less than 50% complete, could sit indefinitely in a subject's mind until long after this study runs out of funding and the subject is returned to the... If such an instance were to occur, there is a non-zero chance that they could recreate the portion of the poem even after undergoing MK-15 procedures. The fragment of a memory could wait like a landmine waiting to be triggered. On top of this, it has been put forward that the partial activation state may be a result of the subject filling in the gaps of the poem incorrectly, causing a less effective version of the full poem's effect. However, since we have no way of knowing which words of the poem to change while still preserving the original context, and with no way of getting the IH9 to do it for us without breaking protocol, such a hypothesis is untestable. It is very possible, maybe even likely, but it would be too expensive and dangerous to test. There could be as many as 4 mental copies of an existing outside of the testing room at any one time. With our current resources, it's indefensible. Better to move on and work under the assumption that the entire poem is needed to create the full effect, and some bastardized version of it may have a reduced effect. Test 5. Subject was shown a version of the poem translated into Chinese, the subject's most fluent language. Subject entered a state of extreme sadness and panic comparable to a full activation state. After 11 minutes, the subject self-terminated, with a scalpel left on the table for such a purpose. Research note. As lead researcher, I made the judgment call to leave a knife in the testing room, going against normal protocols. I defend that this doesn't represent a breach of safety standards, as the subject will almost certainly commit suicide. And even if they don't, we have now added an automatic tranquilizing function to the test room. Since this series of tests has a binary result, there's no need to string it out any longer than necessary. Test 15. Subject was shown a version of the poem translated into Spanish. The subject entered a full activation state and self-terminated after 7 minutes. Test 3. Subject was shown a version of the poem translated into Tok Pisin, an English-derived pidgin language from Papua New Guinea, which the subject can speak and understand fluently. After some consternation of the poem, the subject seemed to enter a much milder partial activation state than has been previously seen, wherein he seemed substantially more glum and apathetic, but not hysterical or in despair. The audio was compromised fairly early on as the subject weighed the meaning of the poem to himself. For the next hour, the subject sat in the chair slumped and stared at the scalpel on the table, but never self-terminated. The subject was then tranquilized and terminated by guard staff, as per the new safety protocols. Research note. It is very likely that the translation into Tok Pisin did not fully capture the original content of the poem. As a pidgin language, it only covers simple concepts, and usually by using metaphor, often maritime-based, as Papua New Guinea is, and has always been, a seafaring country. Considering this, we are able to deduce that not every language will be able to convey the IH payload of the poem, and that will entirely depend on whether or not the language has the proper words to represent the content of the poem. The research team was worried that continuing to test different languages could potentially lead to us deducing some information about the content of the poem and lead to partial or full recreation of the poem in our thought patterns. I agree with this assessment and canceled all upcoming translation tests. I've also submitted a formal addendum request for the IH9 management to review concerning the potential risk of accidentally deducing dangerous information from etymological or linguistic testing. After this, we're moving on to treatment testing. Test 5. Subject underwent a full paralyzation of lingual function before testing and was strapped to a medical gurney. The medical research team then began the process of hooking up the subject to liquid nutrition, hydration, and waste disposal. After being shown the full poem, the subject entered the full activation state and began thrashing and crying as expected. The subject was closely monitored for a period of 7 days as a control for future tests. After this test period, the subject was terminated. Research note. Initially, the subject was meant to be kept and monitored indefinitely, not only as a control, but to see if the poem's activation state would ever wear off. However, team morale was flagging unsustainably from constant exposure to the subject's states. I made the call to cut the test short, and I made a new requirement for subjects of the upcoming test. Namely, they have to be the ones the research team will have no sympathy for. Test 6. Subject underwent lingual paralyzation and was strapped to a gurney. Subject was fitted to medical equipment and then shown the poem, entering the full activation state. The subject was given a course of cutting-edge mood stabilizers provided by the company. No noticeable effect after 1 week. Subject terminated. Test. Subject underwent preparation and was shown the poem. After entering full activation state, subject was given the treatment as instructed by the on-site expert and an team from headquarters. No noticeable effect apart from the usual side effects. Subject terminated after 1 week. Test. Subject underwent preparation and was shown the poem. After entering full activation state, subject was put into a medically induced coma and was regularly imaged with comprehensive MRIs as well as the usual medical monitoring and our sensors. While anesthetization had seemed effective in earlier testing, it was discovered that the subject's brain was still in a state of extreme sadness even while unconscious. Furthermore, the subject's eyes continued to produce tears just as before. After being woken up on day 7, the subject was asked to indicate whether the medically induced coma had granted them any relief by blinking once for yes and twice for no. The subject indicated no, and this was confirmed several more times. After a brief questionnaire, the subject was terminated. Research note. With our last available subject, I decided it was time to test if the effect ever wears off on its own. That said, after the last few tests, morale is at an all-time low. And so I've decided that the last test will be done with only a skeleton crew consisting of myself, my most loyal researcher, and the 3 guard staff who had demonstrated the least empathy. I've already transferred the rest of the staff onto other projects. Test 5. Subject given to ensure that the discs kept bound, continue under periodic medical supervision and with all vital readouts connected to an alert that would automatically inform research staff of any significant changes. After 1 month, there was otherwise no significant changes. It's noticeably more expensive than expected to keep the subject hydrated. After 3 months, the subject has begun attempting to pretend he's recovered so that we'll end the test. However, his attempts at deception are very ineffective, as he's still endlessly crying and very clearly in the throes of a full activation state. 6 months, otherwise no change. Subject has stopped cooperating with staff altogether, and no form of coercion is effective. 8 months in, subject no longer reacts to all physical pain, otherwise, after 5 years, no change. Subject terminated. Research summary. In all, tests were conducted, and as of 2000, all test subjects have been destroyed. At this time, the effect and its physical mechanism of infection are still not fully understood. There is seemingly no outside force, anomalous or otherwise, associated or correlated with the poem as pertains to its effect on human beings. By all accounts, it seems the danger of the poem is fully encapsulated in the context of its own meaning, or, perhaps more accurately, in the human cognition of the poem's meaning. As soon as the information is digested, the effect is immediate and irrevocable. That said, there does seem to be some mild effect given off by the poem even without full cognition, as was proven by the initial transcription team's experience, as well as the follow-up tests confirming this. Despite not understanding what the poem means, exposure to the words that compose it, in order, does pose some danger, though much less so than full exposure. However, considering the myriad possibilities for this effect, and the inscrutability of its physical modus, there is no reason to believe the poem itself has any threat of spreading on its own. It's completely possible some base version of the poem's meaning can be gleaned instinctually just from seeing it written down in an existing human language. Though this theory is fully circumstantial and up for debate, it's as good an explanation as any, and there's no evidence to show that there's a baked into the original wording. To support this assertion, several tests were conducted with various translated versions of the poem, and, with only a few notable exceptions, in large its effects were exactly the same as in the original English. Considering this, it's fair to say that the words the poem is made up of are not anomalous. Rather, it is their combination and resulting information load that composes the threat. It has also been proposed that the poem may not actually be anomalous at all, and that the ideas, or truths, that the poem brings to mind are just so upsetting that no human person can overcome them. As the head analyst on this project, I vehemently reject this idea. We showed the poem to psychopaths, sociopaths, and people whose very emotional core had been destroyed specifically for testing. All of these subjects failed to resist the poem, and, considering the implications of that fact, we can only conclude that the poem is anomalous. There can be no truth in that poem. There can be no great mystery revealed by a single phrase written by a self-centered, unscrupulous artist. The poem is an anomaly, and that's all it is. Any assertion that one must read the poem to be sure of this is not only being fallacious, but also a real danger to the well-being of research staff. It's just just because we can't tell how it works doesn't mean there isn't something going on. As for the risk assessment, I'd say this one falls in a bit of a gray area. On one hand, there shouldn't be any issue in keeping the poem secured in the IH9 database. As long as the database is secure, there's no risk of the poem leaking out of it. At least not in any way that we've found over the last years. On the other hand, there's every chance the poem will appear on its own out in the world just like it did the first time. It's simply a collection of words in a certain order, with at the very least some semblance of coherence. It's almost a statistical certainty that a one-sentence poem in English will be recreated, and it doesn't just work in English. There's no way we can prevent the poem from forming naturally. However, we should be able to automate a search and destroy bot to remove it from the internet should it ever appear. Furthermore, our discovery team is already watching the world for unusual statistical anomalies, so a spike in unexpected suicides shouldn't go unnoticed. That said, I'm not at all confident that we will find it before Russia or China. Even worse, there's a non-zero chance that a version of the poem will appear, and a single bad actor with some knowledge of cybersecurity will find it before we do. If such a thing were to occur, the world could be plunged into a state of misery that it would never return from. A lone wolf attack of supernatural proportions. It is my recommendation that the entire IH9 database be safely hashed and worked into the infrastructure of the internet as a blacklist filter for all traffic, at very least domestically. I understand that no hash or encryption is 100% safe, but we must have some form of defense from these things, especially knowing what we know now. I don't want innocent Americans reading this poem. Which brings me to the poem's potential. In no uncertain terms, I stand against such an idea. It's all risk, with little reward. Yes, in theory, we could reword the poem until we find an acceptably subtle partial activation effect, and then send it to However, we can't do such a thing without writing it down. There's absolutely no way we can manage to only partially, and then without creating a potentially catastrophic landslide. It will be clear to our enemies that something supernatural has occurred, and then they'll know we've already caught up to or surpassed them. The game will be up, and you better believe they'll blow the whistle. They'll tell everyone in the world what we can do, and we will never be forgiven. It's not worth it, and I can't imagine a situation where it could be. We're better off finding some other weird thing to use as a... At best, the poem could be used as control for anyone trying to hack our systems, but even that would be well over the top and a dead giveaway. My professional recommendation is to lock this thing away and throw away the key. Lead researcher, Dr. FOI is written, produced, and edited by Kit Curtis. The intro and outro song is Illuminati Swagger by Albert Behar, and it's made available on upbeat.io. That's upbeat with 2 P's. Full credit for this song is listed in the description. This episode is titled The Poem, and was based on a real panic attack. The show as a whole is based largely on the SCP archives, except what would happen if it was in the real world where there's no international unity. Finally, thank you very much for listening.